hear me clearly? It's a wonderful honour to be invited to give this inaugural speech for Sahitya Mahotsav 2018. I was here in 2012, and to come back to Rato Bangla is a joy. It's such a wonderful institution, and I'm learning so much more today about the publications. I'm a storyteller. What I do is I tell stories from the world's oral cultures, this oldest form of literature from which all other written literatures stem. And there's such a rich heritage in Nepal, but in all countries of the world as well. These collective wisdoms, stories which, unlike modern stories that are authored often by an individual, were authored or created, and honed and developed by communities, by the people. Not top down, but let's say bottom up. Stories that brought collective wisdom. It's interesting how these days we're changing the way stories are told. Storytelling is happening maybe less than it used to be because of technology. Less stories are being told in families in many parts of the world. But the changes aren't all negative ones. There's also more exchange available to us because of technology and the internet, for example. It's possible to find stories very easily, especially with all of us who are learning English. We can find stories written in English from just about every part of the world. With a quick Google search, I can put in folk story Tibet or folk story Shona, which is a language spoken in southern Africa, and I can find a whole wealth of stories that have been collected from that part of the world. Also, we can learn stories. I often communicate with storytelling friends across the world and learn stories with them. For example, last year, in 2017, I learned a story from Deepa Kiran, a storyteller in Hyderabad. We haven't met in person, but we've met via the internet and share our stories in that way. She gave me a story, a bag full of stories, which is one of my favourites. Storytelling bridges cultures. It helps us to understand our own culture, as just being talked about, seeing ourselves reflected in literature, but also understand other cultures, and that intercultural competence is so important. Just recently, where I teach in the UK, I sometimes go into schools and tell stories, and the UK is a very multicultural country. And I went into a school where a girl had recently arrived, just a couple of weeks before, as a migrant with her family from Bulgaria in Eastern Europe. And this girl, who was 8 years old, didn't speak any English. She'd just arrived in the country. And she was isolated. And the teacher said, "Can you tell a Bulgarian story?" So yes, I went on the internet and found a Bulgarian story in English, but then that wasn't satisfying, because how could I then help her to understand the story that I was telling to her classmates to celebrate her heritage? So then I went on to the website in Bulgarian, and I did understand the word of Bulgarian, and they use a completely different script. But I managed to find a storytelling site in Bulgarian, and then used Google Translate to translate those stories from Bulgarian into English, and then was able to give this girl a photocopy of the story in Bulgarian, which I was telling to her British classmates. But why was I doing this? To esteem and value this student's culture among her British classmates, who would then celebrate her culture along with her. And when she knew that I was telling a story from her culture, and it was a story that she could read, a story of a Zhmei, a Bulgarian dragon, the delight in her eyes and that sense of inclusion, which is so vital and noticeable, evident here in the celebration this morning. Storytelling. Which stories should we tell? Which stories should we share? Words are powerful. The stories we can choose to tell need to send positive messages. Gender issues, for example. So many of the traditional stories around the world are male-dominated. There's a lot of misogyny in stories. So we need to select stories that we want to share that are going to unify us and include. Wisdom tales are vitally important, particularly in many Asian stories. And we all know that storytelling is a co-creative process. It's not just the storyteller telling and the audience passively receiving the story. Storytelling in its nature is co-creative. We create the stories in our imaginations as we listen, and we all make our own pictures and have our own interpretations. So there's a shared experience and an individual response occurring simultaneously. Words carry meaning and power. We, humans, are storytelling beings. In 2017, a chapter was published. I wrote a chapter for a British Council book about integrating global issues in the creative classroom. And my chapter was called Storytelling for a Better World. And I showed, I hope, how very short folk tales can be ways to open up dialogue and projects in classrooms which deal with global issues. I'd like to finish this short speech by telling a very short story that was included in that chapter. A story about freedom. Once there was a rich man, and this rich man kept a beautiful bird, a bird that came from India. And he kept that bird in a golden cage in his house. And one day he came to the bird and said, "Oh, my Indian bird, I am going to travel on business to India. Tell me, what would you like as a gift?" And the bird spoke. "All I want is my freedom." "I cannot give you that," said the rich man. "Ask for something else." And the bird spoke again. "Then I ask you that when you are in India, find birds like me and tell them about my condition." And the rich man, he set off on his travels, and when his business was complete, he went into the forest in India, and he listened, and he looked, and he found a tree, and there were birds just like his own bird in the cage, sitting on branches on that tree. And he spoke. "Indian birds, at home I have a bird just like you, which I keep in a golden cage." And when he said this, one of the birds fell from its branch on the tree onto the ground, lifeless. "Oh no," said the rich man. "This bird has died of a broken heart." In sorrow, he went home, and when he was at home, he went to his bird in the cage, and the bird said, "Did you tell the Indian birds about my condition?" "I did," said the rich man, "and when I said that to them about you, one bird fell from its branch and died." And when he had said this, his own bird in the cage fell from its perch onto the floor of the cage, lifeless. In sorrow, the rich man took the bird from the cage and set the bird's body by the window. And when he had done this, the bird opened its wings and flew out of the window, alive and free. This is how the bird in the forest taught the bird in the cage how to get its freedom. Thank you. Stories set us free. They set our imaginations free. And through dialogue and discussion and creative response and imaginative thinking, stories help us to set ourselves free as well. So this is a wonderful festival and a great honour for me to be part of it. Thank you very much for inviting me.